I want to begin also by acknowledging that wherever we are in this virtual link up, we're on Aboriginal land, and we all owe a debt to the original Australians who nurtured and respected the natural systems of this country. And while it's become a bit of a ritual to acknowledge the traditional owners, it should be much more than a ritual, because the original Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years that the survival of societies in this harsh and unforgiving continent requires an understanding of the limits of natural systems and an incorporation of that understanding, not just into custom and practice and song and dance and ceremony, but into a system of law. And I suppose that's the fundamental principle of AILA, that we need to have, as the original Australians did, a system of laws that allows us to live within the limits of natural systems. Because I was in South Australia when the drawbridge went up, and those of us well past the first flush of youth strongly urged not to travel, I'm on Kaurna land, so I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the region from which I am virtually speaking. I'm going to talk about the bioregion, and I'll say before it becomes embarrassingly obvious that this is a superficial introduction. I'm breaking the ground, which will be reduced to a fine tilth by Susie and Sandra and later speakers, who, as I pointed out to Susie, have probably forgotten more about the bioregion than I will ever know. This is just a simplistic introduction to the notion of the bioregion and how we should be thinking about it. So what is a bioregion? It's defined as a relatively large land area characterised by broad landscape scale natural features and environmental processes that influence the function of entire ecosystems. And as Michelle mentioned, there is a biogeographic regionalisation of Australia that recognises 89 bioregions. I think the initial interim bioregionalisation only recognised 85, but we found another 4 in the last few years. And it's accepted as a logical and functional framework for conservation, land use and planning. The important thing is that it's based on biogeographical features, not political boundaries. The political boundaries of Australia are essentially arbitrary lines drawn on the map by colonial bureaucrats in Britain, most of whom had never been further south than the Isle of Wight and had no idea what they were regulating. And it's obvious to anyone who, for example, has walked the boundary track between O'Reilly's and Binnaburra that there is no natural boundary between New South Wales and Queensland where the arbitrary line has been drawn, any more than the River Murray forms an artificial, a natural boundary between New South Wales and Victoria. And we would be much better served by thinking in terms of catchments or bioregions rather than the arbitrary lines drawn on the map by colonial bureaucrats. Interestingly, in 1989, New Zealand reorganised its local government and it set up regional authorities with responsibility for environmental management. And the regional authorities are based around catchments. And that is a politically rational approach because it means that if the authority manages its catchment responsibly, it gets the benefit of that. If it's irresponsible, it bears the cost. And you can't blame somebody else who on the other side of the river is mismanaging, that it makes sense to manage along biogeographical boundaries rather than political boundaries. And it's obvious to anyone who's walked in that area that the South East Queensland bioregion extends well into New South Wales. And if you look at the map of Australian bioregions, you can see that the South East Queensland bioregion extends basically from about Curtis Island to well south of the Clarence River. The Queensland map has 13 bioregions, and we're situated towards the bottom end of southeast Queensland, and you can see on that feature Fraser Island is about in the middle and it goes well north of that, and our jurisdiction stops at the Tweed River, but of course the biogeographical region extends beyond that. I want to emphasise the linkages because successive speakers will be dealing with parts of the picture, but fundamentally the geology determines soil composition because the soil is basically the weathered rocks plus whatever detritus the biota have left. Soil and climate determine vegetation. And the French have the notion of terroir, that, for example, they believe that the wine of a region has a taste that reflects not just the grape variety, but the nature of the soil and climate. And they talk about goût de terroir, the taste of the terroir. And even someone with as unsophisticated palate as mine can tell whether a Shiraz wine has come from grapes grown in the Hunter Valley or grown in South Australia. And on a good day with a following wind, I might be able to differentiate McLaren Vale Shiraz from Coonawarra Shiraz, because the soil and climate determine not just what plants grow, but how they grow. And so the qualities in the grapes grown in McLaren Vale are different from the qualities of the same variety of grape grown 50 kilometres away in the Barossa or 100 kilometres away in the Coonawarra. And the vegetation influences what birds are there, what animals are there, what insects are there. And the pattern of herbivores in turn determines which carnivores are present. And the biota in turn, by leaving the remains of their bodies and their excrements, affect the soil. So it's all one integrated package that starts with the geology, but is fundamentally shaped then by the biota. The geography of the region, I think, is pretty obvious. The west of the region is mountainous. There's several large ranges. There's also isolated volcanic peaks like the Glasshouse Mountains, and there's several large sand islands like Bribie, Moreton, North and South Straddie, and of course Fraser Island, the world's largest sand island, as well as many smaller islands. If you look at the map of land use, what's striking is that by far the greatest area of land use in South East Queensland is still grazing. That's the yellow area on this map. And the next largest, the grey areas, are the natural areas. Still a significant fraction of the area of South East Queensland is natural vegetation. The spreading red splodges are residential, and of course the problem for natural systems and the problem for maintaining biodiversity is the steady encroachment of residential in places where it shouldn't be permitted. And those of us who are concerned about the environment are constantly fighting battles against inappropriate developments like the Sekisui proposal just north of where I live at Yurumba. If you look at South East Queensland overall, tree cover is still about 30% of the region. The geology of the bioregion is very complex. There are several sedimentary basins. Originally, the geologists named the basin around Brisbane as the Moreton Basin and the one in northern New South Wales as the Clarence Basin. They're now recognised as part of the same, and there are smaller ones like the Nambour Basin and the Maryville Basin. There's a significant volcanic and plutonic province in the west of the region, mainly a result of active subduction. And interestingly, I found, digging out some information for this presentation, that the Gympie province, which has yielded over 100 tonnes of gold, seems to be what the geologists call a unique stratotectonic unit. In other words, the rocks around Gympie that yielded all that gold have no obvious relationship with the rocks around it, north, south, east or west. And they've now concluded that it's a, quote, an exotic terrain that collided with the continent in the Triassic. Says something about Gympie, but I digress. If you look at the surface water catchments, there are several large rivers and a range of smaller rivers, and a surprising number of water storages. People are familiar with the large ones like Wivenhoe and the Hinds Dam, but there's a very large number of smaller reservoirs in South East Queensland. And our rivers are very seasonal. In this graph, the blue bars are the average rainfall for each month, and it's not news to anyone who lives here that there's much more rain in January and February than in the cooler months. But the lower figures are the flows of the major rivers, the Logan, the Brisbane, the Albert, the Bremer and the North Maroochy. And while I think everybody who lives here knows that there's more water in the rivers in summer than in the winter, What's striking about that graph is the scale of the difference. That the flow of the major rivers like the Brisbane River and the Logan River in January and February is about 10 times what it is in August and September. And it's those seasonal flows that influence the sedimentary deposits and the biota around the river catchments. We have significant wetlands. Basically, the whole of Moreton Bay is a significant wetland, and we have a few smaller areas that are Ramsar listed, in other words, are of international significance. In terms of the biota of the region, I refer you to the 2016 biodiversity planning assessment for the region. And if you go to that web page, which I've given the address for at the bottom of this slide, you'll find 3 expert panel reports on fauna, flora, and the landscape, and a summary report which draws together the learnings from those particular expert panels. It divides South East Queensland into several sub-regions. The significant point is that the sub-region of the Sunshine Coast extends from the sandy region to our north, round through Brisbane and down to the Gold Coast and on into northern New South Wales. The conclusion of the report is that biodiversity in this region is facing several threats as a result of rapid population growth, unsustainable land management practices, and the clearing of native vegetation. What's particularly significant and important is because the region is highly fragmented and a lot of the vegetation has been cleared, approximately 97% of what remains is considered of either state or regional significance. In other words, basically, almost all of the vegetation that remains is of significance, either at the regional level or at the state level. In terms of more detail, the expert panels, fauna, flora and landscape, identified 92% of the bioregion as having state or regionally significant biodiversity values. And they gave reasons for identifying them as having significant values for biodiversity. They are refugia, areas where species that have otherwise disappeared still remain, areas containing high species richness, a concentration of endemic species, in other words, species which are not found anywhere else, or which contain important habitat for major taxa. And they also noted the need to delineate landscape scale ecological corridors. That's particularly important in the context of what they described as a sub-criteria. As a pedant, I have to point out that criteria is the plural, and singular is criterion, but the new criterion of nominating areas likely to act as climate refugia, recognising that climate change is happening, recognising that it will continue to happen and would continue to happen even if we had a national government that was going to do something about it, rather than a national government that's still in denial because of the long time lags in the system. Carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere today will on average still be there at the end of this century, and since we are putting more carbon dioxide into the air than natural systems can absorb, the concentration will continue to increase and the climate will continue to change. So it's really important to ensure that as far as possible, the species are able to respond to increasing temperatures and more very hot days and changing rainfall patterns by having corridors within which they can move. This map shows the areas that the expert panel saw as being of either state or regional significance. Those of state significance are in blue, those of regional significance are in green. And what's obvious from that is that there's very large areas like Fraser Island, Moreton Island, the whole of the Great Sandy region, north as far as Curtis Island, south as far as South Straddie, that are of state significance. There are large areas of the mountainous hinterland that are of state significance, as well as areas along the scenic rim. What does this mean? Well, what it means for the sort of discussion we're having today is that the biodiversity of South East Queensland faces several threats. The impact of rapid population growth and infrastructure is fragmenting the landscape, not just directly because of the pressure for new housing and new work opportunities, but also the provision of infrastructure like large road schemes that fragment the landscape. Other important threats include unsustainable land management practice, the fact that we are still clearing native vegetation, the presence of both point source and diffuse pollutants from urban, industrial and agricultural areas ending waterways, and the impacts of introduced plants and animals. And of course, all of those pressures are more or less directly related, directly proportional to the population of the region. And the fact that we have a local government that's cheerfully talking about having 180,000 more people on the Sunshine Coast means we have a local government that's committed to not just continuing but accelerating these threats to the biodiversity of the region. In terms of the impacts of climate change, which are now so obvious that almost everybody who isn't in the federal parliament has noticed them, the report said that all of those threats could be exacerbated by climate change, and that's resulting in significant risks to the entire bioregion, from coastal ecosystems to montane cloud forests. Maintaining ecosystem resilience through landscape connectivity and topographic variation critical to mitigating the effects of climate change in the future. Susie Chapman reminded me that the group at the Australian National University have been doing each year since 2000 an assessment of environmental conditions in each of the bioregions. And the overall environmental score for South East Queensland for 2019 was a score out of 10 of 0.8. Now, I've been a teacher for the best part of 50 years, and you get 0.8 out of 10 in a class quiz, you don't have to do much more than get your name right and number the questions correctly. I mean, 0.8 out of 10 is an appalling score. And it reflects the fact that almost everything in 2019 was among the worst conditions since the assessment began in 2000. It was the year with the lowest total rainfall, the year with the least soil moisture, second lowest river flows in the last 20 years, the most days over 35 degrees in the last 20 years, the lowest amount of vegetation growth, second lowest vegetation leaf area, and the greatest amount of biomass burned. The point of that depressing assessment is that things are getting worse, and it really needs determined action by local communities to hold back the tide and protect what remains of our biodiversity. And that requires, I suggest, a systems approach. We urgently need to protect the remaining habitat, but we also need to improve connectivity to allow plants and animals and insects and birds to respond to climate change by moving. We need a determined effort to remove invasive species, and most importantly, we need to monitor changes over time and be prepared to adapt. When I was first drawing attention to climate change 30 years ago, the motto of the time was that we should manage what we can't avoid and try to avoid what we can't manage. There will be further climate change that we can't avoid, but at the same time as trying to avoid what we can't manage, we have to manage what is unavoidable. Now, none of that should be controversial because nearly 30 years ago, COAG, meeting in simulated majesty in Canberra, adopted a national strategy for ecologically sustainable development. So in principle, the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments, Coalition and ALP, are committed to a pattern of economic development that does not reduce opportunities for future generations, that's aimed at equity within and between generations, that protects our remaining biodiversity and maintains the integrity of natural systems. Of course, most governments show no sign they even know we have a national strategy, let alone see that as the guardrails within which we make our day-to-day decisions. In the absence of an overall vision or national policy, environmental decline continues. In a sense, climate change is the most urgent problem, but biodiversity loss is the most critical problem. Because with concerted effort, we could restore a pre-industrial climate in a century or two. But biodiversity loss is permanent. There is no obvious way of restoring a species that's gone extinct. So we need to protect what remains of the biodiversity, and the critical way of doing that is to address the driving forces, to monitor what we're doing, to learn by doing, and be committed to adaptive management. And that is exactly 20 minutes of introductory ramble.